So welcome everybody. My name is Daniel Jackson. I'm a professor at CSAIL, and I'm delighted to welcome you to another episode of Hot Topics in Computing, our CSAIL series. And we're delighted today to welcome Dr. Yaneer Bar-Yam, who is the president and founder of the New England Complex Systems Institute. Yaneer is actually one of us. He got his PhD in physics from MIT. And he's known as one of the founders of the field of complex systems, known especially for his work in multi-scale representation. He's been developing mathematical methods and working on their application in many areas, from cell biology to social networks. And he's widely advised government and the military on all kinds of critical issues related to terrorism, crises, disease prevention, financial issues, economic issues, and has applied ideas to complex system science very widely. He's also the author of 2 books, and he's a research scientist at the Media Laboratory. And he's been very engaged in thinking about the coronavirus pandemic, and we're delighted to hear from him today. Yaneer is planning to speak for just 15 minutes. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to hear from Yaneer, and then we'll take questions. So Yaneer, over to you.
Great, thanks. Maybe I'll take a couple of extra minutes to give a little bit of background before I dive into the outbreak. So, about 15 years ago, we were analyzing very simple models of, call them predator-prey models, or host pathogen models of propagation of pathogens in a population, but including long-range transportation. And what we found was that there was a phase transition where you went from local transmission to global transmission and extinction. Now, this obviously raised concerns, and I've been talking about it for 15 years, trying to get people to pay attention to the clearly implied global risk that we're facing because of increasing transportation. Unfortunately, it was very difficult to get people to pay attention. I even spoke at WHO in January of 2014, and they didn't take sufficient action. Ebola started a couple of months later in West Africa, and was 10 times the size of the previous outbreaks. And it is a perspective, of course, people think about the future in terms of the past. And so, and that's statistical thinking also, right? By statistical sampling of a distribution, what to expect in the future. But obviously that failed in this case. In fact, they were projecting by dynamic simulations that it would go to burnout with 10 million people dead. Instead, it was only about 10,000 people dead. And the reason was because of an action that was taken that was consistent with what I was recommending and trying to get the government and the UN to adopt at the time, even by directly talking to relevant people, but the action was too slow. But eventually I called the people on the ground and they told me, yeah, that's a great idea. We started doing that 3 weeks ago. And what it was going door to door, identifying symptoms early and isolating people at that time. And so the outbreak went up exponentially and down exponentially and was stopped. Now, and I've been working with Ebola in DRC since then in collaboration with WHO and so on. Let me give jump to the present and tell you, the way I focus on understanding systems is by identifying what are really the most key pieces of information, right? So in this case, there are 3 pieces of information that we need to know. One is that it's a terrible disease. So it is roughly, the numbers are 80% of cases are mild or moderate. People heal by themselves. 20% require hospitalization. Of those 20%, about 14% are serious, and 6% require intensive care with a ventilator. Now, the other thing that you need to know is that we don't have immunity through this. So as far as we know, this will go through the entire population. So there is no way that we have enough ventilators. There's no way that we have enough medical care to provide that kind of level of care. And so that that's a real problem. The second thing that you need to know about this disease is that it propagates very rapidly, very rapidly. So the doubling time is between 2 and 3 days. and that's just really, really fast. So it's almost basically about a factor of 10 per week. All right. And the way it propagates is also difficult because it can propagate by contact, but it can also propagate by sneezing and coughing, but it can also propagate by just breathing the same air that someone is breathing. You have to be further than 10 feet apart to avoid becoming infected. 6 feet is the usual number, but for long periods of time, of course, it'd be larger, but let's say 6 feet is the standard number. In addition, you can get it by contaminated surfaces. So someone breathes out or sneezes on surfaces. So any surface in a public space or in a shared space is potentially transmission. So that's number two. It propagates fast and easily. Oh, and also it's contagious just about the time when symptoms start. So symptoms are very mild when they start, so you probably don't recognize them. So it's really hard to tell whether it starts before symptoms start or after symptoms start. But roughly speaking, at the time that symptoms start, it propagates. And that happens, so there's an incubation period of 14 days, but typically 3 to 4 days, or 3 to 5 days. So it propagates really rapidly. The third thing that you need to know is that we can stop it. Okay, and the way to stop it has been shown. So if we put those three things together, right, it's a horrendous disease, it propagates really rapidly, and we can stop it, then the obvious policy recommendation is we have to stop it. And the sooner we act, the better, because every day we wait, it gets much worse. And you're constantly seeing only the tip of the iceberg because there are all of these people that have already been infected that you don't have documentation that they have cases, right? Because they're still asymptomatic. And you have, the second thing is that you haven't done enough testing. In particular, in this country, there hasn't been enough testing. So there are confirmed about 60,000 cases as of yesterday in the United States. And we know, I mean, you probably at this point know even from friends or family or even yourself, there are people who are symptomatic that have not yet been tested, a lot of them. Okay, so if you want to know how many cases there are out now, so roughly speaking, there are, you know, sort of factor of 5, maybe a factor of 10 cases out there just because of infections that have not yet become symptomatic. And then there are also another factor of 5 or whatever, 10 of cases that you haven't tested. So that's really bad news. It's very, very bad news. Now, just to give you a sense of the dynamics of this disease, China locked down the province of Hubei, which is around the city of Wuhan, and surrounding provinces. They locked down about half of the country eventually, 100 million people. It's not half of the country. It's a substantial number of people. And they locked it down when they had 800 cases, just 800 cases. And they ended up with 80,000 cases. So a factor of 100. And they locked it down. They didn't let people out of their apartments except to go to, you know, pick up essentials. And a couple of weeks in, they even stopped that. They only did delivery or whatever it was that they did. They really went all out. And the interesting thing is that they stopped it. So 5 weeks later, 4 to 5 weeks later, in most of the area, it was gone. And in the epicenter, it was gone after 5 to 6 weeks. Now, why did it happen so rapidly that they were able to eliminate it? And the answer is straightforward. If you stop the transmission chain, it goes, just as it's going up exponentially really rapidly, it also goes down really rapidly. And in this case, the transmission is very clear, so we understand very directly why it's going away, right? Because you have a 2-week incubation period. So if you lock everything down and you prevent transmission chains, then in the first 2 weeks, the people who have been infected at the beginning they show symptoms during 2 weeks. Now, in principle, if you isolated everyone with the symptoms, and then you can stop the outbreak from there. Of course, there have been new cases because people live with other people. So there's another round of cases, and that round may be substantial relative to the first round. But then you have another 2 weeks, and basically the outbreak goes down rapidly. And if you want plots of this, I can show you plots. But this is very straightforward stuff. And by the end of the 4th to 5th to 6th weeks, you're done. And now, today, in fact, they've eliminated the restrictions on the area of Hubei province. They're doing this very carefully after eliminating the restrictions in the rest of the provinces earlier. Now they've eliminated in the Hubei province. They're still keeping Wuhan under restriction, and that's supposed to be released in a couple of weeks. Now, there's no doubt that they're being very cautious about it for good reason, but basically it took 2 months. So on January 23rd, they locked down the area. 2 months later, they're moving back to normal existence. Now, what do we need to do in order to stop it? What are the actions that need to be taken? There are 3 different basic pillars of the response. The first one is actually travel restrictions. So remember that when we studied pandemic behavior, it was just a very simple model. The relevant variable, the relevant thing that mattered was the long-range transportation. So what you really want to do is you want to shut down travel. And the reason is obvious. If you think about it, it's obvious because if you have areas that have the disease, you don't want it to spread to areas that don't have the disease. It's a multi-scale approach, right? You're isolating individuals, you're isolating families, you want to isolate communities. And if you don't know where it is well enough, you just lock everything down at different scales. So that's fairly clear. But it turns out that this has many, many different effects that are really important. And among them are the fact that if you separate the space, then over the initial period of time, you can figure out where the disease is, and you can relax the restrictions like they did in China earlier in places where it is not present. And so setting up protocols of safe transfer between zones and understanding what the zones are is a critical part of doing the response. So that's number one. Number two is testing. Testing. The more testing we do, the more information we have, the more we can localize the outbreak, the more we can identify individuals to isolate. Basically, the way to think about it is that we want to isolate everyone that has the disease. But if we don't know who has the disease, we basically have to expand the categories of people that we isolate. So if there's an outbreak in a city, we can't figure out who has the disease. So we isolate everyone in the city. If we can preferentially identify who has the disease, then we can isolate those. So in West Africa with Ebola, because the transmission happens after symptoms arise, you start with symptoms, and then you can isolate everyone that has the disease. You only have to wait for fever. You don't even know that the people have Ebola, right? The category there, the generalized category becomes people who have fever. That's not just the people who have Ebola, that's people who have other diseases. But as long as you take the larger category and isolate them, then you know you've got the people who also have the disease. So that's the issue of testing. And for the coronavirus, the testing is generally DNA testing, but one can also use symptoms. And again, whatever category you can make that includes the people who have the disease, that's great. It restricts the intervention that you have to make in the society. The last intervention, and again, the first one was travel restrictions, the second one was testing. The third one is the lockdown. And the lockdown, in principle, only has to be used for areas of high outbreak density, right? You can manage, if you have a few cases in a city, you can manage with contact tracing. That was shown with Singapore, because most of the transmission is through close contacts. And all of the discussion about the idea that there are these asymptomatic cases that are floating around in the population, it's bullshit, because otherwise Singapore wouldn't have been able to do contact tracing among close contacts and sustain the low level of outbreak that they have. And in fact, now they've let kids go back to school because they really have it under control. So the lockdown has to happen when you don't have an understanding of where the disease is. Unfortunately, right now, that's in basically all of Europe and in the United States. And there are areas in the United States where there are fewer cases, like Alaska and Hawaii and North Dakota and South Dakota and New Mexico. And the point is that we might be able to get away with closing their borders and not letting stuff in. But at this point, I would just recommend, and I have recommended, a national lockdown, because again, we don't have visibility. We have 10 times as many cases as we can see now, maybe 100 times, because we're not doing enough testing. So let's lock it down, find out where the cases are. And if we find areas where there are no cases or very few cases, then we can release them and start moving back to normal. So that's basically the picture. I'm trying to think of a couple of other things that I should say. One is that, let me talk about the travel restrictions for a moment, because I mentioned that. Epidemiologists have this insight, which is very important, which is that if you just do travel restrictions, it doesn't help very much. Why? Because if you do travel restrictions, 2 weeks later, you have so many cases in the place of origin that they're going to break through any travel restrictions that you've imposed, because there's always some leakage. And that's kind of the insights that's been driving a lot of public health advice, including the advice that comes from WHO and CDC and all of the public health authorities. And that's a real problem, because it's not true that we only need to use travel restrictions. When we combine travel restrictions with other things, it does make a difference, and they work together synergistically and very powerfully. And without travel restrictions, the other ones don't work nearly as well. So the point is that this is one of these, factor analyses. If you analyze one factor by itself and it doesn't work, then you don't think that maybe in combination with other things, it's going to work and be very powerful. And so this is kind of, again, a complex systems things. You have to think about how things work together. The last point that I want to talk about is the medical response. There is no way that we can save our medical system from hell at this point. Today it was announced that there are 100 healthcare workers in the Boston healthcare system that have the disease already. And there's no way that we can magically create enough ventilators. I just heard that there were ventilators that were made from scuba equipment or something like that, that are being used now in Italy to save some of the patients there, because they've been doing medical triage over the last week because they're overwhelmed and there are a lot of people dying. They're up to a death rate of over 10%. And that's, it's not terrible enough that the disease is terrible, but they're letting people die because they don't have ventilators for them. Now, so it's going to happen here. But there are ways to make it better, and there are ways including creating better equipment and all kinds of things that we can work on. But of course, the most important thing is to cut off the outbreak. There's nothing that will matter more than making sure that the outbreak is stopped as soon as possible. And we can talk about all kinds of things, even when we do home isolation of people, it's really better actually to atomize. 80% of the transmission in China was within family groups. And remember, because the transmission happens right at the beginning of symptoms, it's really hard, even when you do testing, to detect who's going to transmit to their family members. So if you have family members that, can go someplace else, it's actually really important to do that. That also applies to such things as healthcare workers. So healthcare workers are going to become infected. There's really nothing that we can do to stop it, no matter what they wear in PPEs. And they're really just now wearing surgical masks because they don't have PPEs, personal protective equipment, that is, full body suits. So they're getting sick. And one thing that we can do to help them is to have them live separately from their families. And we've been working to try to set that up in hotels. It's one of many projects. I'll tell you what we're doing in a few moments. The other thing that we can do is really, really protect high-risk institutions, nursing homes, rehab facilities, psychiatric wards, places where people have to be in proximity to each other, prisons. China had a bunch of prisons that got infected. There was the care facility in Seattle. There are now, last I heard, which is already 2 or 3 days ago, there are six nursing homes that have infections in them in New Jersey. And this is horrendous because it will go through them like wildfire. So, so this is, not that it isn't doing that to the whole world, but you understand what I mean. So, so there are many details about what can be done in the response. Let me tell you what we've done. So at the end of the January, Nassim Taleb and I and my former postdoc Joel Norman put out a piece warning about the situation. And since then, I've been tracking what's going on and trying to have people understand both the success of China's response and eventually, and I have to say to some extent to my surprise, the fact that people did not react in Europe and the US more strongly. But once that happened, and this was about 3 weeks ago, I sent out a call for volunteers. And within 2 days, there was a website up. It's called endcoronavirus.org. That's endcoronavirus.org. We have about, I have to look at it now, 3,600 or something like that, people on a Slack channel collaborating on many, many different projects, ranging from technical side of things, building websites and apps and so on, to communications and writing materials and all of that stuff, and outreach to communities and to policymakers. And then we also have more recently, but very strongly, efforts in the medical response area, and that includes, what do we do about ventilators? Can we get more masks? How do we deal with the dynamics of the disease in the hospital system in various ways? All kinds of things that are innovative, like group testing for high-risk institutions. So there's a lot of stuff. One of the other one, which is really important, is that we're trying to get more testing. And one of the ideas that we were developing is that to use academic labs, because they're an existing resource. And I reached out to Eric Lander at the Broad Institute, and they're developing 1,500 per day testing capability, but that's tiny. It's a drop in the bucket. And again, we're behind the curve, so we need exponentially growing capabilities. So we've been trying to ramp that up. There's been some testing of the ability of university labs, and I don't know if I'm at liberty to say where it is, but in one of the states it's happened, and it came up positive, and they're figuring out safety protocols. But there are already, I don't know, some 3,000 or 5,000 labs across the country that have offered to participate in such an effort. So this is an all hands on deck effort. It's been very difficult to watch things happening, and still we're in a situation where people are being reactive rather than proactive. When the hospitals fill, the policymakers are making decisions that they have a hard time doing previous to that. The ability to anticipate 2 steps ahead and say, hey, this is going to happen, why don't we do it now so that it doesn't happen? This isn't there. And again, we have this 100-fold increase. By the way, the reason why the hospital signature is very late is not just that you have all of these cases that you don't know about, but it's also that the disease progression starts from everyone being mild, typically, with very few cases. And then after a week or 2, it converts into severe. So everyone's going around saying, hey, this isn't so bad. maybe place is different from the other places that have had the disease. It doesn't seem so bad. We're okay. And then a week later, 2 weeks later, things happen, right? And so New York is, of course, experiencing a horrendous problem. I've talked a little bit longer than I expected, but I've laid it out for you. Let me take questions.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Yaneer. So if you have questions, you can send them on the chat channel to Gillian, and we'll pass them on to Yaneer from there. So the first question that we have is from Ruth, and her question is, does locking down local regions mean not allowing truck drivers to deliver, for example, food from one part of the country to another?
No. The basic idea is that you remember that we have to deal with essentials, right? So essentials, people have to get food and, medications from pharmacies and other essentials. And so a lockdown in China also allowed people to go out and to get groceries. Only after, I think, a couple of weeks did they prevent people from doing that. By then, they had set up systems to get the necessities to people. And they allowed them to go out once every 3 days or whatever it was. So that's the essence of a lockdown. And similarly, the delivery of goods can continue. There are some caveats, which is that you should arrange for the delivery of goods to be done in a safe way. And the details of doing that, one can understand what they look like, but I don't actually know the specifics of how it was done in China. And we could talk about what it would look like here, but basically you want no contact delivery, whether it's coming to your house or whether people are shipping stuff across the country. The virus survives on surfaces for 1 to 2 days, on cardboard, sort of less than a day, but it's better to leave things kind of 2 to 3 days before you use them, or wash them with soapy water, which is very effective at killing the virus.
Great, thank you. So Mohammed asks, what do we do to stop another pandemic break out in the future?
So, hey, one of the things about, extreme events is that each one is going to be different from another in ways that are substantial. And again, my focus is stopping this one. And ask me that question in a month, and we'll go through song and dance and verse about what could have been done and what should be done for the future. And again, I've been talking about this for 15 years, so I have a lot that I've thought about what should be done. But again, ask me in a month.
If we were able to suppress this particular round, would we have to be worried of the high probability of a secondary wave? Is China worried about a secondary wave of infections?
And again, this is the kind of thing where you imagine demons in the future, but you deal with the present, right? So the basic statement is no. There's very good reason to believe that if we get it down to a few cases, we can control it, even if there are a few cases. Now in China, there are none, last period of time. All of the cases, if you look at the news in China, they're all imported and those people are all quarantined. But Singapore, again, controlled it with a few cases. So if there is a case here or a case there, then contact tracing works. You don't have to lock down the whole place, and you don't have to be afraid of an outbreak. And remember, we know about the disease. We have tests for it. The doctors know to watch for it. So there's a very different barrier to an outbreak taking off. So there's every reason to believe that we can control it. And if something else happens, it's more likely that we'll get another zoonotic transmission that will knock us down than that this particular one will come back in waves.
Great. Here's a question from Pratik. He asks, can you comment more on the asymptomatic people and their role or non-role in transmission? It seems to be a common assumption that they are in fact transmitters.
So the key thing to understand is that there are symptoms that are mild. And so defining what an asymptomatic person is or is not is very confusing, right? But the basic statement is that essentially everyone progresses to symptoms. And then the question is only, when you saw them, when the transmission happened, were they symptomatic? And that's a different question, remember. So it's not that there are all these people that are asymptomatic out in the universe and they stay asymptomatic, right, in the population, and they're transmitting. They do progress to symptoms, but before they progress to symptoms, they may have weak enough symptoms that you didn't notice. And there are even tests that have been done. So people have been tested positive that don't yet show symptoms. but then essentially all of them progress to symptoms.
Thank you. Tony asks,
And again, it wouldn't be possible to do contact tracing if there were a lot of people that were asymptomatic transmitting the disease, right? Because contact tracing, what you do is you go to someone and you say that you know has the disease, and you ask them who were they in contact with. So almost all of the transmission is in close contacts. People who live together, visited together for enough time that they were in strong exposure.
Here's a question from Tony. What's the best way to stay up to date with expert opinions on the pandemic?
It depends what you mean by experts. So the problem is that there's a fair amount of confusion around about what's going on. And, I mean, I'm putting out information on my Twitter feed. It's not as densely put out on the website, which is really targeted for a particular purpose. But my Twitter feed right now is probably the best thing that I would recommend. If you want to go to other sources, again, I mean, there's the usual suspects, right? WHO and CDC, but I think we differ on some subtleties, like, they will still say that travel restrictions are not a good idea. So we wrote a paper, by the way. There are several papers that we've done analyzing the situation. They're very short papers. They're not really, designed to serve a fully, many of them are not for an academic audience, but if you read through, they're really the crux of what's sort of essential for this context. But for example, there's a paper that we wrote on treating communities as the element of contagion, not just individuals. So it's a multi-scale picture where you have individuals that are transmitting, and that gives rise to community transmission. And there's an element of what the community response is to the outbreak. And that's a paper that's available on our website. If you go to NEXI, the New England Complex Systems Institute.edu, there's right now a banner at the top that says, coronavirus. And if you click on that, there's a web page with a lot of stuff that we've been doing, including the analysis of community level transmission and some other pieces that are important, some of them pedagogical, like how to think about exponential behavior, and others sort of a little bit more technical, having to do with trying to explain what's going on.
So here's a question from Davis, which I suspect is on a lot of our students' minds, and I suspect you won't want to answer. But the question is, do you believe the fall semester will start as usual, or will it continue online?
So there's something that's really, really powerful to understand in this context and often in other contexts, which is that scientists generally act as observers, right? It's not so true about computer scientists, because computer scientists are actors. They do stuff and make things. But scientists generally act as observers, and they think about the world in terms of asking, what will we predict about what's happening? Right? So the central question is, can I predict? There's a much more, and this gives rise in the popular mind to this. So let me tell you the popular mind. Let me say, the point is that here, there's a different question, which is, how does the future depend on our choices, on the choices we make? And in popular context, right, this is the, optimism versus pessimism, right? Is it going to be good? Is it going to be bad, right? So this is kind of that question, is it going to be good? Are we going to be ready for the fall semester and then we'll be back to normal? Or is it going to be bad and the fall semester will be destroyed? So that's an optimism or pessimism question. And my answer is, we have the choice. It's our choice, what we do as a society, but also as individuals. Because as individuals reaching out to family and friends, and surely this, group that is here with all of the power and respect that is present to this community from the outside world, the actions that we choose to take are really important in influencing what's going to happen. And I was really pleased to see this statement. The governor of California was the first of the governors to execute a lockdown. And in his speech, he said this exact same thing. He says, it's our choice. We have to decide what the future will be. So I'm going to answer to you in the same way. It's your choice. It's our choice. And I invite you to participate in spreading the word and advocating on behalf of this, all-out effort to stop it. Because if we do the all-out effort, it's only going to be 5 weeks, 6 weeks, maybe 2 months. And despite the horrendous hell that we will go through, we can be back to normal in a couple of months.
Here's a question from Pete. If a patient gets the virus and recovers, can that patient get it again? Also, can that recovered patient transmit it to others?
So the problem is that there is we don't actually know exactly how it works. So, the way people are doing things is probably fairly conservative and trying to let people recover quite strongly before they let them out into the world, because we surely don't want to let people transmit more. People are treated as recovered and released into the world. So we're pretty confident that there is no regular transmission. There are a few cases of reappearance that have been documented. And of course, we don't know exactly what that means, but it might mean one of two things. Either the virus is still in their bodies and then comes back, or they actually get reinfected. And immunity is not as good as it might be. Because there are these viruses that come back, later in life or at other times. And so, what is it? Shingles that comes back, right? And some other viruses. So we haven't had enough time to live with this virus to know whether it's coming back or whether they're being reinfected. So we just have to wait and see. But there's no reason to believe at this point that that's a significant effect. The effect that is significant, that already there's some documentation of it, is that the cases that are serious may have long-lasting health effects.
So this is an optimistic side of the same question from Niti, who asks, is it possible that many people have already gotten the virus and overcome the disease in the period from January to March and thus are already immune?
No.
Okay.
No. Yeah.
Okay, here's a question about Singapore. Chi Him says, Yaneer keeps referring to Singapore as evidence that asymptomatic patients cannot transmit. But as far as I know, Singapore tests asymptomatic people and then isolates close contact to those who tested asymptomatic but positive. Can you comment on this? It seems to me that Singapore is simply doing things more carefully.
So yes, they are doing things more carefully, and yes, they have very careful behavior. But still, the idea that there are many asymptomatic cases is associated with the idea that there is unidentified individuals that are transmitting, people that you don't know that are not close contacts. Those would not be identified in Singapore also. So that's not the case. And also, we know from the studies in China two things. They've done samples of the population, right, to see whether there are cases that, there are samples that are being taken sort of generally in the population that would reveal coronavirus if it was there. And the number of cases that are found is very, very tiny. So there's not just one piece of evidence for this. And yes, no, it's not happening, and there's no reason to believe it's happening.
Great. Here's a question from Martin. This is a provocative and I think an important one. We've heard people saying that the harm caused by shutting down the economy exceeds the harm that would be caused by just letting society run and letting the pandemic run its course. How do we quantitatively evaluate such arguments and compare the harm from the two or more alternative courses of action, especially given that the expertise required to evaluate the harm from the different causes of action resides in different scientific communities?
Absolutely, real problem. And one of the problems here is that it's the epidemiologists that have always claimed that it's bad to shut down the economy for reasons that I do not quite understand. The point here is actually that it surely depends on when you do it, right? I mean, we could have done it weeks ago. In principle, none of this was necessary. All right. I mean, every time people talk about this, right, hey, it's bad to stop flights from China to the United States because then you're going to have economic impacts. Now, today we look at all this hospitals, the stuff that is going on, and we say, hey, yeah, well, looking back 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, shutting down air travel, even worldwide, is kind of better than what we're seeing now. But the answer is much simpler than that. When you have an exponentially growing horrendous disease, the economic impacts are going to be huge, just huge. Any reasonable assessment of it. And again, I mean, I'm not the only person who's saying this. If you want to talk to economists who are saying this, but of course, there's going to be differences of opinion about anything, because people have crazy ideas as well as sound ideas. But I don't think there's any question. I mean, this is an exponentially growing process. If you don't shut it down at all, right, you let it go to completion, what are you talking about? You're talking about a healthcare system that's going to be overloaded and over 10% of the population dead. And people have this idea, hey, it's only the older people. It's just not true, right? There's just a report that 50% of the people in New York in hospitals are between the age of 18 and 49, if you want to take that cut. And remember that the young people very often, not that rarely, get severe disease. And if the hospital system is overloaded, they're going to die. It's not just the older people who are going to die. And you can't separate the older people from the younger people. And that's, if you were so immoral as to say, hey, let's let, all of the people or older people die, people over 50 have already a 3% chance of death. So we're not talking about a small effect. And the main thing that we have to think about is that when you have this kind of exponentially growing outbreak, what you see now is really always the tip of the iceberg. And if you let it go, it's orders of magnitude larger, right? It's still very tiny in terms of the percentage of the population, maybe 1% in this country, right? Remember, China locked down at 800 cases, they end up with 80,000. Here we now have 60,000 cases, which by the same trajectory, which is not as unreasonable, right? It's not unreasonable. There have been lockdowns, but they're recent and they're not complete. And if they're not complete, they're not sufficient. So we're talking about millions of cases. Millions of cases is still just 1% of the population. It's still just 1% of the population if we lock down today. So any idea that we will somehow let it go and it will be okay, either ethically or in terms of health and life or in terms of economics, is really off base. Orders of magnitude off base.
Here's a question.
And it's been off base since the beginning, since January.
Here's a question for you from Hugo. You mentioned testing as if it was a given thing, but the fact is that the United States has been struggling with testing. Testing is of little value if we don't have diagnostics with reliable sensitivity, true positives, and specificity, true negatives. At this point, we really want to make sure we don't miss the true negatives.
So it's not a problem with the negatives. Remember, if we have it is a problem with the false negatives, right? So if we say that someone is not sick, but the tests are reliable enough to matter a lot. And South Korea used mass testing, drive-by testing, as a major part of their response effort. And Germany is doing it now. And if you look at the behavior of Germany's, and I could show you plots if you want to see it, and you can look at my tweets today. I have a tweet today about this. Germany and South Korea have done much, much better by using mass testing in order to detect mild cases early and to limit the transmission and also to improve the health care of those people. So their death rates, even though their death rates progressively increase because of the fact that the cases progress, right? They start mild and then progress. They're still doing much, much better than other parts of the world. And so they've demonstrated the utility of testing. And the problem here is ramping up the testing is hard. You have to do accelerate. And the system here is like turning whatever it's called, a aircraft carrier, right? The system is big. So New York broke away from the rest of the country, built its own tests, and they've done 20,000 tests. They're still not caught up. And we can tell this because you look at the fraction of positive cases out of the overall testing pool, so we can tell whether they're able to test mild cases. And we know from people talking that they're not testing mild cases, of course, but you can tell also from the data. And the bottom line is that even in New York, we're not caught up in testing, but all of the other states are much farther behind New York. And the reason is that the national effort is bogged down in whatever bureaucratic red tape and approval processes that the government, the federal government is doing, and whereas the states can move more quickly. So what we really need to do is to accelerate the pressure politically here on the state, and to talk to the governor, to go to the governor and say, look, we really need to do this. We need to do this now. Broad Institute can do this. We need to figure out how to get approvals approved in a day instead of in a week. And by the way, other labs at MIT and Harvard and, Tufts and so on can also do these tests. And let's just ramp it up aggressively and do it.
Great. So here's a question that actually you've been asked before, but I want to ask it to you again because I suspect a lot of people were very surprised by this, and it's going to be a big takeaway from your presentation. So I wonder if you can just go over this again very carefully. So let me put it in the words of this particular questioner, which is in this case Deb Roy. So he asks, I was surprised to hear Yaneer say the idea that people are walking around asymptomatic and spreading the virus is bullshit. Did I hear right? Is he saying that is not the case?
Correct. So the answer is, it depends how you think about the word asymptomatic. Are you thinking about them as asymptomatic forever? And the answer is no. They will develop symptoms. Almost everybody over 14 days develops symptoms. But they can transmit just before they show symptoms. So those are the asymptomatic cases that enable transmission, but they're not asymptomatic as a case. They're just asymptomatic at the time where they're doing the transmission.
But before you seem to be saying that they don't actually start transmitting until they have some symptoms. But you're now saying it's possible for them to transmit before they have any symptoms whatsoever?
So this is somewhat something that we don't quite know scientifically. But what we think is happening is that they are able to transmit around the time where they develop symptoms. And part of the reason why it's hard to tell us is that the symptoms are so mild when they start that how do you tell whether the person was actually symptomatic? And typically it's between close contact. So there's no timestamp on exactly when that contact happened. It could have been a day earlier, a day later. So we don't have the exact numbers, but if you look at the transmission rate through the population, the time at which people become asymptomatic and the time at which people receive the disease, the time interval is about the same. In fact, it may even be a little bit earlier, but that has to do with how you do different averages. So it's a little bit hard to tell.
Here's a very interesting question about federalism. And the question is this, it's from Mason, who asks, what are the consequences of responsibility for the virus being relegated to local governments? That is, how bad are the consequences of uncoordinated containment efforts? For example, the feds are leaving it to states to decide containment policy, and states like Florida are letting counties decide. And counties are even relegating decisions to individual cities. Further, all US airports are still flying, roads out of areas like New York still allow people to leave, and most local shelter-in-place orders aren't seeing strict enforcement.
So if you have a central authority that makes good decisions, then that's helpful. But if you don't, then adaptiveness is a good policy, right? So if people do things more quickly locally, which sometimes happens, that may not be a bad thing, right? This is a complex systems problem of centralization versus decentralization. It surely would be much, much better if the federal government took strong action and did a national lockdown. And I have an op-ed that says that a few days in USA Today. But absent a strong central decision-making process, it's then better that states have the ability to act because they can save themselves and lead the way, and that leads to a cascade, right? So when California made a decision to do a lockdown, that led within a day for half a dozen or dozen other states to do lockdowns. So there are trade-offs in these two things. Right now, we need everyone on board. Sure, we need the federal government on board, we need the states on board, we need towns on board. We also need individuals on board because individuals ultimately take responsibility for the actions that are happening in the system. And in Italy, when the government did a national lockdown, it didn't translate into individuals taking responsibility, and the outbreak continued. So they had to lock down even harder, and we're seeing that play out over the last few days.
Here's a question from Theodoros, who asks, how effective are masks in helping the wearer not contract the disease?
Very effective. That's why healthcare workers wear them. And the fact that the federal government, the CDC, is saying, hey, you don't need masks, again, it's just a, they didn't plan ahead. They don't have enough masks for healthcare workers. They don't have enough PPEs for healthcare workers. Healthcare workers are, they're working without equipment.
Here's a question. Yeah.
Yeah. So they said, hey, we shouldn't let people who don't have masks because they are taking equipment away from healthcare workers. So there's a higher priority use. So I respect that. It's important for healthcare workers to have masks. And there are ways to get masks. You can sew your own mask or have someone sew a mask for you. I just put out instructions about this. Or if you have masks, use them. And if you feel that the healthcare workers should have them, donate them to the hospital nearby because they don't have enough masks.
Here's a question about herd immunity. Mengwan asks, whether herd immunity is something that could happen. And I guess this is related to this bizarre thing that came out of England, that at some time they were considering letting things run. Is there, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, so this is one of those cases where people made assumptions in models and then they came to conclusions and they didn't check their assumptions or their framing of the question. And the bottom line is there are a lot of things that are wrong with that. First of all, you can't get herd immunity up to until you have 70%, and there's not enough young people to get herd immunity. That's obvious. Not young, healthy people, even more restricted. But all of that's nonsense because young people do get sick and die. And even if they get sick at 0.1% instead of a 2% level, like the average of the population, think of what it is that is 0.1% of the entire population. Right? It's totally crazy to think that you're going to do that. And they just didn't really think it through. Yeah.
Great. I think we have time for, let's see, Max, I'm not sure we have time for any questions at all, actually, because we're coming up.
Actually, I have to actually jump to another call because we're doing, all kinds of things. Please help. Figure out things that you can do in your capabilities. It can be professional. It can be at a personal level. Reach out to the people that you care about. Make sure they understand what's going on and are taking action to protect themselves. If someone has symptoms, basically what they need to do is to keep themselves as healthy as possible. We have a piece about respiratory health on our website, so get it to their attention. If you want to help out with our, all hands on deck effort, we have partnership with all kinds of organizations to do stuff, and let me know what I can do to help you. But you really have a lot of authority coming from where you're coming. And it would be really helpful if you would reach out both to policymakers and to the public and use the good name that we have at MIT to make a difference in what's going on. It's really important.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Yaneer, for an incredibly interesting and informative talk. And we hope to hear from you again and more at happier times when hopefully this problem has been addressed.
Yeah, stay well, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Stay in touch.
Bye-bye.